In a land of many gods, a man had gold, had servants, but had no heir. It was then that an invisible voice broke the silence. "Leave your country and go to the land I will show you. Look to the heavens and count the stars. So shall your descendants be." In the darkness, the Eternal sealed a covenant, a promise that cannot be broken. How far will faith go when the altar demands what is most loved? From Abraham shall be born kings, and all the families of the earth shall be blessed. The waters of the Euphrates flowed slow and golden beneath the rising sun over Ur, reflecting the stepped towers that rose like giant fingers reaching toward the heavens. In that dawn which seemed like any other, the destiny of humanity was about to be rewritten by a voice that would echo through the centuries. Abram walked through the broad streets of polished stone, carrying at 75 years the dignity of a man who had accumulated considerable wealth through cattle trading and spice commerce. Much like the great American ranchers who would one day build empires across the western plains. There he lived with Sarai, his wife of incomparable beauty, whose dark eyes reflected the silent melancholy of a woman who had known all earthly riches except the one her heart truly desired, a child. The years had passed like leaves carried by desert winds, and Sarai's barrenness had become an invisible wound that bled silently in the couple's heart. While other men of his position boasted of their lineages and heirs, Abram contemplated a future where his goods would scatter among servants and distant relatives, where his name would be forgotten like footprints in sand. The sun had reached its zenith when Abram withdrew to the quiet of his private chambers, away from the household bustle and business that awaited him. There, amid silence perfumed with essences of myrrh and aloes, he surrendered to the contemplation that had become his refuge in moments of unrest. But this time, the quietude was interrupted by something that would change not only his life, but the course of human history. There were no thunders tearing the skies, nor earthquakes making the earth's foundations tremble. The voice that spoke to Abram's heart came like a gentle breeze, but carried with it the weight of all eternity. It was a voice that came from nowhere, and yet from everywhere. A voice that had no audible sound, and yet resonated clearer than any music ever heard. Leave your country, your people, and your father's household, and go to the land I will show you. Urs. The words echoed in Abram's innermost being with the force of a cosmic commandment, each syllable engraving itself on his spirit as if carved in eternal stone. He knew, without a shadow of doubt, that this was not the voice of Nana or Marduk or any of the gods whose images populated Ur's temples. This was the voice of the Creator of heaven and earth, God, the only one who existed before the stars were lit and who would remain when they were extinguished like consumed candles. I will make you into a great nation, and I will bless you. I will make your name great, and you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and whoever curses you, I will curse. And all peoples on earth will be blessed through you. The promise poured over Abram like rain on parched earth, each word laden with creative power and eternal purpose. A great nation would be born from him, the childless man. His name, which seemed destined for oblivion, would be made great through the centuries. And through him, all the families of the earth would find blessing, a responsibility and privilege that transcended any earthly wealth or honor. Abram's heart beat like war drums as the magnitude of the revelation enveloped him. Leaving Ur meant abandoning everything he knew and loved, the security of his riches, the predictability of his business, the company of relatives and friends, the comfort of an established life. It meant trading the known for mystery, certainty for faith, security for adventure toward a destination not yet revealed. But there was something in the divine voice that awakened in Abram's depths a thirst he didn't know he possessed, the thirst for eternal purpose, for meaning that transcended the limits of an earthly life, for participation in the grand plan that governed the universe. Ur's riches, however vast, now seemed small before the promise of becoming father of nations and channel of blessing for all humanity. When Sarai returned from the city markets, she found her husband transformed. There was in his eyes a brightness she hadn't seen in years, a determination that spoke of irrevocable decisions. Without hesitation, Abram shared with her the extraordinary vision, the words that had changed the course of their lives in an eternal instant. And Sarai, woman of faith and courage, recognized in the voice that had spoken to her husband the same authority that had separated light from darkness and called into existence all that exists. The days that followed were of feverish preparation. Abram liquidated his businesses in Ur, selling properties and converting goods into gold and silver that could be transported. His flocks were gathered from distant pastures, his servants informed of the great journey that awaited them. Some chose to remain in Ur's familiar security, but many were willing to follow their master in the adventure toward the unknown, trusting in his leadership and the divine promise that had called him. Lot, Abram's nephew and son of his deceased brother Haran, decided to accompany his uncle on the journey. Young and ambitious, he saw in the expedition an opportunity for adventure and prosperity in new lands. Terah, Abram's elderly father, also chose to depart, perhaps moved by curiosity to know the horizons beyond Ur or by the desire not to be separated from his son in his final years. News of Abram's departure spread through Ur's streets like wildfire in dry straw. Some considered him mad for abandoning a prosperous life in search of ethereal promises. Others whispered that he had discovered new trade routes and kept secret about hidden riches in distant lands. But the wisest perceived that something supernatural was in motion, that forces beyond human understanding had touched that man's life and called him to an extraordinary destiny. On the last night in Ur, Abram climbed to his house's terrace and contemplated the city that had been his world for 7 decades. The temple lights flickered like terrestrial stars, the voices of night merchants echoed through the avenues, and the familiar aroma of spices and incense perfumed the breeze that came from the river. It was beautiful, it was prosperous, it was safe, and he was about to trade all this for the uncertainty of a divine promise. But when he raised his eyes to the true stars that dotted the celestial dome, Abram again felt the unshakable certainty that he had been called to something infinitely greater than earthly comfort. Each star seemed to whisper the promise of innumerable descendants. Each constellation drew in the sky the map of a glorious future where his name would be remembered by countless generations. Dawn came with the golden sunrise that had witnessed the divine call, and with it, the moment of the great departure. Abram's caravan stretched through Ur's streets like a human river in motion. Hundreds of servants and animals organized for the epic journey that awaited them. When Ur's gates closed behind the caravan and the city began to diminish on the horizon, Abram did not look back. His eyes were fixed on the path ahead, on the mystery of the promised land that awaited him beyond the dunes and mountains. In his heart, a certainty burned like eternal flame. He was no longer just Abram of Ur, the prosperous merchant. He was now Abram, the pilgrim of faith, the man called by the Eternal to be father of nations and blessing for all the earth. The desert stretched before the caravan like an ocean of golden sand, its infinite undulations breaking against the horizon where earth met sky in a trembling line of mirage and promise. The sun, still young in the morning firmament, already cast its relentless light upon the procession that serpentined along the ancient trade routes, transforming each grain of sand into microscopic diamond that wounded unprotected eyes. Abram rode at the expedition's vanguard, mounted on his light-colored camel, his eyes protected by a fine fabric that couldn't completely hide the brightness of determination that animated them. Sarai traveled in a litter specially constructed for the journey, its silk curtains protecting her from sand-laden winds and curious glances from travelers who crossed their paths. Even at 65, her beauty remained legendary, and Abram had taken special care to ensure her safety and comfort during the crossing of dangerous lands that separated them from their destination. Young Lot rode near his uncle, his eyes shining with adventure's excitement. For him, the journey represented liberation from Ur's predictable routines and the promise of unlimited opportunities in the unknown lands that awaited them. His own flocks, inherited from his father and multiplied through astute business dealings, added to the mobile wealth that constituted the caravan, transforming it into one of the most prosperous expeditions ever seen on those ancestral paths. The first weeks of travel passed without major difficulties. The trade routes connecting Ur to the northern lands were well established, with known wells and rest points where caravans could regroup and resupply. Abram's servants, men experienced in the arts of terrestrial navigation, guided the expedition with mastery, reading in the stars and rock formations the signs that kept the group on the correct path. As the caravan advanced northward, the landscape gradually transformed. The infinite dunes of the southern desert gave way to more rocky terrain, where distant mountains began to outline themselves on the horizon like promises of change and renewal. More frequent oases allowed prolonged rest, where men and animals could recover from the journey's trials and prepare for the more challenging stretches that awaited them. It was during one of these prolonged stops that concerning news arrived about Terah. The elder, who had courageously endured the journey's initial difficulties, began showing signs that his strength was failing. The desert's cold nights and scorching days had taken their toll on the aged body, and the most experienced servants whispered among themselves that perhaps the patriarch would not complete the journey to the promised land. Abram then made a decision that demonstrated both his practical wisdom and filial devotion. He would establish a prolonged encampment at Haran, the prosperous commercial city that rose like an oasis of civilization at the crossroads of the great routes linking east to west. There Terah could rest and, if it were the Almighty's will, recover strength for the journey's continuation. Haran proved to be a fascinating city, smaller than Ur, but equally prosperous, its streets teeming with merchants of all nationalities and its taverns echoing with languages from distant lands. The local temples, dedicated to the same lunar gods venerated in Ur, provided a familiar sense of religious continuity that especially comforted the older servants, not yet completely converted to faith in the one God who had called their master. For months the caravan remained in Haran, while Abram established commercial contacts, and Terah fought against the illness, slowly consuming his strength. Young Lot took advantage of the time to explore the business opportunities the city offered, his own flocks multiplying through intelligent trades and profitable partnerships. But it was during this forced stay that Abram faced his first great test of faith since receiving the divine call. Haran was comfortable, prosperous, familiar. It would be easy to settle there permanently, building a new life that combined Ur's prosperity with the journey's adventure. The inner voice that whispered this temptation grew stronger each day, especially when Terah showed moments of improvement that fed hope that the elder could still complete the journey. But the God who had spoken in Ur did not remain silent in Haran. In dreams and visions, in moments of solitary prayer under the desert stars, the divine voice reaffirmed the original calling. The promised land still awaited, and the journey should continue regardless of earthly obstacles. The final decision came when Terah, on a clear spring morning, called his son to his bedside and, with the lucidity of final moments, blessed him for the journey's continuation. The patriarch died as he had lived, with dignity and faith, his last breaths whispering prayers to the God who had chosen his family for an extraordinary destiny. Terah's funeral was conducted with all the pomp due to a man of his position, but it also marked the end of an era and the beginning of a new phase in Abram's epic journey. Free now from the filial obligations that had detained him in Haran, he could finally proceed toward the land that the Almighty had promised to show him. Reorganizing the caravan took weeks, but when it finally set in motion again, there was in it a renewed energy, a sense of purpose that spoke of near destinations and promises about to be fulfilled. Abram still didn't know exactly what land awaited him, but he knew with absolute certainty that each step brought him closer to fulfilling the divine words that had changed his life forever. The land of Canaan revealed itself to Abram's eyes like a vision from divine dreams. After months of journey through arid deserts and the rocky plains of the north, the first sight of green hills and fertile valleys stretching as far as the eye could see filled the patriarch's heart with a mixture of admiration and reverence that made him dismount from his camel and prostrate himself on the sacred ground he had just stepped upon. From the heights where the caravan had made its first stop, the panorama that unfolded was breathtaking. Rivers serpentined through plains covered with lush vegetation, their waters reflecting the deep blue of the Mediterranean sky. Groves of secular oaks dotted the gentle hills, while wild olive and fig trees created welcoming shadows in protected valleys. It was a land that truly flowed with milk and honey, where nature's abundance spoke of the Creator's generosity. But Canaan's natural beauty hid more complex and dangerous realities. This was not an uninhabited land awaiting new colonists. Fortified cities crowned many of the strategic hills, their imposing walls and watchtowers reminding all newcomers that this land already had its established masters for generations. Smoke rose from altars dedicated to Baal and Ashtoreth, Canaanite gods whose cults included practices that made even pagans from Ur shudder. The first city the caravan encountered was Shechem, nestled between the mountains of Ebal and Gerizim. Abram approached the city with the caution of one who understands that each step in unknown territory might be the last. His armed men flanked the caravan, not in war formation, but in clear demonstration that this was not an expedition of defenseless refugees, but an organized migration of a prosperous people prepared to defend their rights. The Canaanites of Shechem received the newcomers with curiosity, mixed with suspicion, typical of established peoples facing large-scale migrations. The city's king, a man of impressive stature whose scars spoke of countless battles, granted audience to Abram in a low-ceilinged room decorated with war trophies and symbols of local gods. It was in Shechem that Abram lived one of the most sacred moments of his entire journey. While establishing his camp in a protected valley near the city, the voice that had transformed his life in Ur spoke again, this time with a clarity and power that made the very earth seem to tremble under his feet. "To your offspring, I will give this land." The promise echoed through his being like silent thunder, laden with authority that admitted no doubts. There he was, a childless man in strange land, surrounded by warrior peoples who could crush him if they so desired. And the God of the universe promised him that this land, all this magnificent and terrible land, would belong to his descendants. Seized by a reverence that made him completely forget the surrounding dangers, Abram built there his first altar in the Promised Land. Stones were carefully selected and stacked, creating a sacred place where incense could rise to the heavens, carrying the patriarch's prayers and gratitude. The fire he lit upon that altar would be the first of many that accompanied his journey through Canaan, sacred landmarks of a faith that grew with each divine manifestation. But heavenly promises did not eliminate earthly realities. The stay near Shechem soon became problematic, as local resources began showing signs of strain under the additional pressure represented by Abram and Lot's flocks. Canaanite shepherds watched with growing hostility, the sheep and goats of the foreigners competing for pastures they considered theirs by ancestral right. Abram, perceiving that the situation could easily degenerate into armed conflict, made the wise decision to move his caravan to other regions of the Promised Land. The journey continued southward, passing through Bethel, where another altar was built and where the Lord's name was invoked in a prayer that echoed through the surrounding hills like a decree of spiritual possession. But it was then that Canaan revealed another aspect of its complex character. The Promised Land was not free from nature's whims. A devastating drought began to ravage the region, transforming the green fields into parched expanses where cattle withered and wells began to dry. It was as if the very land tested the faith and determination of the newcomers, challenging them to prove whether they truly deserved the promises they had received. The famine that followed the drought was relentless. Day after day, Abram watched his flocks diminish, his servants weaken, his food reserves deplete. The land that had been promised as inheritance seemed to violently reject his presence, as if the Canaanite gods fought against Abram's God for control of those sacred territories. Faced with a choice between stubborn faith in the divine promise and the practical necessity of preserving the lives under his responsibility, Abram made a decision that would test his trust in the Almighty in an unexpected way. He would go down to Egypt, where rumors spoke of full granaries and rivers that never dried, to wait for the famine to pass in Canaan. The journey toward Egypt was a somber procession compared to the triumphant departure from Ur. The remaining animals walked slowly, their bodies lean, constantly reminding everyone of the situation's gravity. The servants, though still loyal, whispered among themselves about the wisdom of following a man whose God seemed to have abandoned him in the first great crisis. But it was during this forced journey that Abram faced a dilemma that would reveal unexpected aspects of his character. Sarai, even at 65, retained beauty that turned heads in any city of the known world. In Egypt, land famous for its court's sophistication and its rulers' cruelty toward those who challenged their wishes, such beauty could represent not a blessing, but a death sentence for the husband who tried to protect her. "I know what a beautiful woman you are," Abram said to Sarai as they approached the borders of Earth's most powerful empire. "When the Egyptians see you, they will say, 'This is his wife.' Then they will kill me, but will let you live." The solution Abram proposed revealed both his cunning and his fallible humanity. Sarai would present herself as his sister, not his wife. Technically, it wouldn't be a complete lie, since she was Abram's half-sister, daughter of the same father but different mother. But it was certainly a half-truth intended to preserve their lives in desperate circumstances. The Egypt that received the famished caravan was a vision of splendor and power that rivaled the most grandiose memories of Ur. The pyramids rose against the horizon like mountains built by gods, while the Nile flowed majestically between banks covered with lush vegetation, its blessed waters guaranteeing eternal prosperity to the world's most fertile valley. Abram established his camp near Memphis, the great capital, where he presented himself to authorities as a nomadic merchant seeking temporary pasture for his flocks. The gold he still possessed bought not only residence rights, but also grain sufficient to feed men and animals during the months necessary for recovery. But Sarai's beauty, even disguised as Abram's sister, did not go unnoticed by the ever-vigilant eyes of Egyptian courtiers. Rumors of her loveliness quickly reached the ears of Pharaoh himself, who ordered her brought to the palace for personal evaluation. What followed was a sequence of events that tested Abram's faith in a way he had never imagined. Sarai was taken to the royal harem. Abram received princely gifts as brother, of the new addition to Pharaoh's wives, and for weeks lived in anguish, knowing that his wife was in the palace of Earth's most powerful man, while he remained powerless to rescue her. But the God who had called Abram from Ur did not remain passive before the crisis. Mysterious plagues began to ravage Pharaoh's palace, strange diseases that affected only the royal court, and that Egyptian magicians could not cure or explain. The connection between Sarai's arrival and the beginning of calamities soon became obvious, even to the world's proudest monarch. The confrontation between Pharaoh and Abram was an encounter between two worlds: earthly power in all its splendor and spiritual authority, protected by the invisible God. The king of Egypt, accustomed to being venerated as divinity, found himself forced to recognize a superior power that protected that apparently insignificant nomad and his family. "What have you done to me?" thundered Pharaoh, his voice echoing through halls of marble and gold. "Why didn't you tell me she was your wife? Here is your wife. Take her and go." The expulsion from Egypt was accompanied by even more magnificent gifts than those initially offered: gold, silver, cattle, servants that exponentially multiplied the caravan's wealth. It was as if Egypt itself, intimidated by the power of Abram's God, sought to ensure there would be no future reprisals for the inadvertent offense. When the caravan, now enormously enriched, again crossed Canaan's border, Abram carried not only material riches, but a deeper understanding that the God who had called him was truly the Lord of all nations and all kings. The famine had passed, rains had returned to the promised land, and green pastures again awaited the patriarch's flocks. Prosperity brought unexpected challenges that threatened family harmony. Abram and Lot's flocks had multiplied so much in Egypt that the pastures around Bethel could no longer sustain both herds without creating constant conflicts between the shepherds. What began as minor disputes over grazing rights quickly escalated to confrontations that threatened to break family bonds. Abram, observing with patriarchal wisdom, understood that the situation demanded a radical solution before it transformed into civil war. "Let's not have any quarreling between you and me, or between your herders and mine, for we are family," Abram declared on a golden morning. "Is not the whole land before you? Let's part company. If you go to the left, I'll go to the right. If you go to the right, I'll go to the left." Lot contemplated the Jordan Valley that opened like a divine garden to the east, its irrigated lands offering incomparable fertility, where prosperous cities like Sodom and Gomorrah promised abundant commercial opportunities. His choice was quick and revealing. He pointed to that plain without consulting his uncle or considering the spiritual implications of separating from the man who carried divine promises. As soon as Lot disappeared into the eastern horizon, the familiar voice echoed again in Abram's heart. "Look around from where you are, to the north and south, to the east and west. All the land that you see, I will give to you and your offspring forever." Renewed in his faith, Abram moved to the great trees of Mamre near Hebron, where he built another altar to the Lord. The location offered strategic position to observe events unfolding in the region. It was from Mamre that alarming news arrived about a devastating war. 4 powerful kings from the east, Kedorlaomer of Elam, Amraphel of Shinar, Arioch of Elasar, and Tidal of Goyim, had formed military alliance to subjugate the rebellious cities of the Jordan Valley. For 12 years, Sodom, Gomorrah, and neighboring cities had paid tribute to Kedorlaomer. In the 13th year, they rebelled, refusing the demanded tributes. The response was swift and devastating. In the 14th year, the combined forces descended like a storm of iron and fire upon the entire region. The invading army was a terrible war machine, composed of veteran soldiers equipped with bronze and iron weapons. They began in the north, crushing the Rephaites, massacring the Zuzites, and annihilating the Amites, in a calculated terror strategy designed to demonstrate that resistance meant total extinction. When they reached the Jordan Valley, The kings of Sodom and Gomorrah attempted to resist. In the valley of Siddim, near the Dead Sea, the forces of the 5 cities faced the invaders in a battle lost before it began. The defeat was total. The kings fled to the mountains, abandoning their cities to systematic plunder. Among the captives taken was Lot. The news reached Abram through an exhausted fugitive, who prostrated himself telling of the catastrophe. The patriarch now faced impossible reality. The invaders possessed armies of thousands of veteran soldiers, while he counted only his domestic servants. But the faith that had led Abram to abandon Ur knew no impossibilities. Without hesitation, he ordered all men capable of bearing arms to present themselves for military expedition that would defy the laws of probability. 318 men responded to the call, a ridiculously insufficient number under normal circumstances. But they were devoted servants who had shared the epic journey from Ur, men forged by desert trials and united by absolute loyalty to the patriarch who had led them through miracles. Mamre, Eshcol, and Aner, Amorite princes allied to Abram, joined their forces, recognizing that the threat affected the entire region. The pursuit began immediately, the pursuers advancing with falcon speed, while the invaders moved slowly, laden with spoils and delayed by captives. The opportunity came near Dan. The eastern kings established extensive camp through valleys and hills, demonstrating confidence in the impossibility of effective attacks. Abram studied the camp with inspired strategist eyes. The very extension had become weakness, as the scattered forces couldn't regroup quickly during night attack. The plan was audacious to the point of recklessness. He divided his men into 4 groups that attacked simultaneously different sections of the camp in the deepest moment of night, creating confusion and panic that multiplied the effect of their limited forces. The execution was a masterpiece of precision. In absolute silence, the warriors infiltrated designated positions. When the moon hid, plunging the world into darkness, Abram's war cry echoed like celestial lions' roar. The chaos was total. Veteran soldiers awakened abruptly, couldn't distinguish friends from enemies in darkness, attacking each other in blind panic. Cries of betrayal spread like fire, transforming organized military force into hysterical crowd, seeking escape from enemy that seemed to be simultaneously everywhere. Abram and his men moved through the night battle like spirits of divine vengeance, fighting not only with human strength, but with authority of men fulfilling the Almighty's will. Each blow was guided by the same invisible hand that had protected Abram in Egypt. The victory was complete and unexpected. At dawn, the 4 kings had fled in total disorder, abandoning spoils and captives. Kedorlaomer, who terrorized the entire region, ran through the desert like common criminal. Lot was found among the liberated captives, unharmed but humbled by the experience that had taught him painful lessons about the price of choosing questionable company. His reunion with Abram was marked by tears of gratitude and recognition of divine protection. On the triumphant return, crossing the valley of Shava, 2 figures represented different paths for dealing with extraordinary success. The king of Sodom emerged offering alliances and division of spoils, temptation of earthly power in its most seductive form. But Melchizedek, king of Salem and priest of God Most High, approached bringing bread and wine, symbols of spiritual communion with the Creator. His blessing echoed like divine confirmation. Blessed be Abram by God Most High, who delivered your enemies into your hand. Abram faced definitive choice between accepting earthly offers or recognizing that his victory belonged to the Most High. His response to the king of Sodom was a declaration of spiritual independence. With raised hand I have sworn to the Lord that I will accept nothing belonging to you, not even a thread or the strap of a sandal, so that you will never be able to say, I made Abram rich. It was categorical refusal of any recognition that might give men credit for victory, that belonged exclusively to the true God who governs nations' destinies. The victory over the eastern kings had echoed throughout Canaan like thunder announcing storm, establishing Abram as a respected military force in the region. However, in the days following the triumph, a deep restlessness began to grow in the patriarch's heart, like shadow lengthening at dusk. The divine promises that had motivated his journey from Ur seemed as distant as the stars dotting the night firmament. Abram now counted 85 years, Sarai 75, and her womb remained closed like a sealed sepulchre. What meaning would promises of descendants numerous as earth's dust have for a childless man walking inexorably toward death? During long, sleepless nights under Mamre's tents, Abram contemplated the starry vastness, questioning the divine silence that followed glorious moments of revelation. Could it be possible that the God who had spoken so clearly in Ur and Shechem had changed his purpose? Or perhaps the promises were conditional, depending on a faith he couldn't maintain with absolute perfection. The patriarch's anguish didn't go unnoticed by Sarai, who watched her husband with the silent wisdom of a woman who had shared decades of joys and sorrows. She knew every expression of his face, every gesture that revealed his most intimate thoughts, and understood that doubt was slowly corroding the soul of the man who had abandoned everything because of a divine promise. It was during one of these nights of questioning that the familiar voice again broke the silence, coming not as gentle whisper, but as command, demanding immediate response. "Do not be afraid, Abram. I am your shield, your very great reward." Situ. The divine presence filled the tent with authority that made the air vibrate, but instead of bringing relief, the words awakened in Abram desperate courage that made him express for the first time his deepest doubts. "Sovereign Lord, what can you give me since I remain childless? And the one who will inherit my estate is Eliezer of Damascus." It was a wounded soul's cry, confession of frustrated hopes springing from the deepest part of his being. Eliezer, his most faithful and competent servant, had by necessity become the presumptive heir of all accumulated riches. But what consolation could there be in leaving the inheritance of divine promises to a man who didn't carry covenant blood? And the word of the Lord came to him, "This man will not be your heir, but a son who is your own flesh and blood will be your heir." The divine response cut through doubts like sharp swords separating light from darkness. It wouldn't be a servant, however devoted, but a son generated by Abram who would inherit eternal promises. The declaration's specificity left little room for alternative interpretations. The miracle of fatherhood would happen even if it contradicted all natural laws. He took him outside and said, "Look up at the sky and count the stars, if indeed you can count them." Then he said to him, "So shall your offspring be." Abram raised his eyes to the celestial dome, where myriads of stars shone with intensity that seemed to increase with each moment of contemplation. There was the visual promise of future descendants, each point of light representing countless generations that would be born from his loins and spread throughout the earth as agents of divine blessing. But there was something more in that nocturnal vision that transcended simple celestial mathematics. The stars seemed to pulse with life of their own, forming patterns that told stories of destinies not yet fulfilled, of nations that would be born from Abram's seed and influence the course of human history in ways his mortal mind couldn't completely comprehend. Abram believed the Lord, and he credited it to him as righteousness. The declaration echoed through creation like cosmic decree, establishing new principle of relationship between God and men. It wouldn't be works or personal merits that would determine Abram's position before the Most High, but simply his willingness to trust divine promises, even when all physical evidence pointed in the opposite direction. In that transcendent moment, Abram became more than patriarch of an earthly family. He transformed into the prototype of all those who, through coming centuries, would choose to believe God's promises even facing impossible circumstances. But the Lord had not finished his revelation. "I am the Lord, who brought you out of Ur of the Chaldeans to give you this land to take possession of it." The territorial promises renewal brought to Abram's mind all the practical difficulties of inheriting land already occupied by powerful and well-established nations. How could his descendants take possession of Canaan when Canaanites, Hittites, Jebusites, and other peoples controlled fortified cities and possessed trained armies? "Sovereign Lord, how can I know that I will gain possession of it?" asked Abram, not from lack of faith, but from desire for deeper understanding of divine methods for fulfilling such extraordinary promises. The answer came in the form of specific instructions for a ritual that would establish formal covenant between the Eternal and the Patriarch. "Bring me a heifer, a goat, and a ram, each 3 years old, along with a dove and a young pigeon." Abram obeyed with meticulous precision that characterized all his acts of worship. The animals were carefully selected from his flocks, each representing specific aspect of the covenant to be ratified. The heifer symbolized strength and prosperity. The goat represented provision and sustenance. The ram spoke of leadership and authority, while the birds connected earthly covenant with celestial realities. The sacrifice preparation process followed ancient patterns Abram had known since his youth in Ur. But this time, it wasn't practiced to appease capricious gods or seek temporary favors. It was establishment of eternal relationship with the universe's creator, based on promises that transcended the limits of human life. Each animal was cut in half with ritual precision, its halves arranged in parallel rows creating blood corridor, through which contracting parties traditionally passed to seal agreement. It was custom for both parties to cross between the pieces, assuming mutual responsibilities and invoking upon themselves the dead animal's curses if they broke covenant terms. But before the ritual could be completed, birds of prey descended from the skies to devour the prepared sacrifices. Abram drove them away with fierce determination, protecting the sacred offering from profanation that could invalidate the entire ceremony. The fight against the vultures represented broader spiritual battle between forces seeking to prevent divine purposes' fulfillment and tenacious faith that refused to allow interference in eternal plan. When the sun began to decline on the western horizon, painting the sky with colors of fire and gold reflected on the arranged sacrifices, supernatural drowsiness descended upon Abram. It wasn't common sleep of physical fatigue, but prophetic trance that would prepare him for revelations his conscious mind perhaps couldn't bear. As the sun was setting, Abram fell into a deep sleep, and a thick and dreadful darkness came over him. The spectacle that followed transcended all limits of normal human experience. From the darkness that enveloped the sacrifice site emerged manifestations of divine presence that made creation itself tremble with reverence. The smoking fire pot spoke of the Most High's purifying power, while the blazing torch represented his consuming holiness that burns all impurity. But the vision's most extraordinary aspect was that only divine presence passed between the sacrificed animal pieces. In normal human covenants, both parties assume conditional obligations that could be broken by mutual failures. In this cosmic covenant, however, God himself assumed all responsibility for promise fulfillment, transforming the agreement into unilateral decree that didn't depend on human perfection. During the prophetic trance, future visions unfolded before Abram's mind, like scroll being unrolled. He saw his descendants multiply and grow, but also witnessed periods of suffering and persecution that tested their faith in unimaginable ways. Know for certain that for 400 years, your descendants will be strangers in a country not their own, and that they will be enslaved and mistreated there. But I will punish the nation they serve as slaves. and afterward they will come out with great possessions. The prophecy revealed complete cycle of descent into suffering, followed by glorious liberation that would establish pattern for all future history of the chosen people. Abram's descendants wouldn't inherit Canaan immediately, but would first pass through refinement in oppression's crucible that would prepare them to fulfill their destiny as priestly nation. The vision also included personal promise that Abram wouldn't witness these tribulations. You, however, will go to your ancestors in peace and be buried at a good old age. It was guaranteed that his life would end in tranquility, surrounded by honor due to founder of eternal lineage. When the trance finally dissipated and Abram returned to normal consciousness, dawn painted the eastern horizon with colors of renewed hope. The sacrifices had been consumed by divine fire, leaving only ashes that testified to the established covenant's reality. On that day, the Lord made a covenant with Abram and said, "To your descendants I give this land, from the Wadi of Egypt to the great river, the Euphrates." It was territory encompassing much more than Canaan's current occupation, including regions that would only be conquered centuries later by the patriarch's distant descendants. Abram rose from the sacred place, transformed by the experience that had sealed his destiny and that of countless future generations. The covenant of blood and stars had established unshakable foundation upon which all subsequent history of human redemption would be built, linking earthly promises of descendants and territory to celestial realities of eternal purpose and universal blessing. 10 years had passed since the covenant established between the pieces of sacrificed animals, and Sarai's womb remained as barren as desert in drought season. The divine promise of descendants numerous as heaven's stars echoed in Abram's memory like distant echo of thunder, real but apparently without imminent fulfillment. Sarai watched her husband with growing anguish, recognizing in his eyes the silent struggle between unshakable faith and implacable reality. At 86, Abram still maintained vigor that defied his age, but she, approaching 76, felt years' inexorable weight upon a body that had never known motherhood's joy. Barrenness wasn't just absence of children, it was open wound in a woman's soul, constant reminder of unfulfilled purpose in a society where motherhood defined feminine value. Each dawn brought hope's renewal, each nightfall, disappointment of another day, without signs of promised life growing in her womb. During long nights of painful reflection, Sarai began questioning whether her own sterility wasn't the obstacle preventing divine promises' fulfillment. Perhaps the Most High expected her to demonstrate faith through practical action, offering alternative path for Abram's seed to multiply as promised. The solution that germinated in her mind wasn't original. Other sterile women throughout centuries had resorted to the same expedient to guarantee family continuity. Hagar, her Egyptian servant, young and fertile, could serve as surrogate, generating children that would legally belong to Sarai according to the era's customs. "The Lord has kept me from having children. Go, sleep with my servant. Perhaps I can build a family through her," Sarai proposed on a morning when dawn's golden light seemed to mock her daily renewed hope. Abram received the proposal with conflicted feelings, reflecting his situation's complexity. On one hand, the plan offered practical path for divine promise fulfillment of descendants. On the other, it represented attempt to accelerate the Most High's purposes through purely human methods, substituting dependence on supernatural intervention with conventional earthly solutions. But pressure from transcurred years and Sarai's apparent impossibility of conceiving weighed more than spiritual reservations. And Abram agreed to what Sarai said, deciding to accept the suggestion that promised to resolve the posterity dilemma through available and culturally accepted means. Hagar was young Egyptian of notable beauty, acquired during the family's stay in the Nile Valley years before. She had served faithfully in Abram's house, demonstrating loyalty and competence that made her appropriate candidate for such delicate role. Her youth and apparent fertility contrasted painfully with Sarai's condition, but also offered hope that human plans could align with divine purposes. The union between Abram and Hagar was consummated with ritual formality that masked underlying emotional tensions. It wasn't marriage based on love or mutual attraction, but pragmatic arrangement intended to produce heir who would carry promises made to the patriarch decades before. When Hagar quickly conceived, confirming her fertility, domestic dynamics in Abram's house transformed dramatically. The young servant, conscious that she carried in her womb the heir to divine promises, began behaving with haughtiness that didn't go unnoticed by anyone in the family. When she knew she was pregnant, she began to despise her mistress. The attitude change wasn't surprising. A slave who had become mother of her master's son naturally reevaluated her position in family hierarchy. But the contempt she showed for Sarai transformed practical solution into source of explosive domestic conflict. Sarai, who had proposed the arrangement as act of abnegation intended to resolve sterility problem, found herself humiliated in her own house by the servant she had elevated to concubine position. The irony was cruel. Trying to build herself through Hagar's children, she had created rival who questioned her authority and dignity. "You are responsible for the wrong I am suffering," Sarai declared to Abram, holding him responsible for situations she herself had suggested. Wounded emotions logic rarely follows rational patterns, and the sterile wife directed her frustration toward husband, who had simply acquiesced to her plans. Abram, caught between two women with legitimate but conflicting claims, chose to avoid direct confrontation. "Your slave is in your hands. Do with her whatever you think best," he responded, returning total authority over Hagar to Sarai and refusing to intervene in growing tensions between them. Sarai's response was quick and severe. Using her authority as house mistress, she afflicted Hagar in such manner that the young concubine's life became unbearable. It wasn't just punishment for insubordination, but expression of years of maternal frustration channeled against the woman who had easily achieved what Sarai had desired for decades. Unable to bear hostile treatment, Hagar fled to the desert, preferring to face wildlife's dangers rather than continue subjected to her mistress's wrath. It was a desperate decision of pregnant woman who chose mortal uncertainty over oppressive security of patriarchal house. In the desert, by the spring on the road to Shur, the angel of the Lord found Hagar in her desperate flight. Divine intervention wasn't accidental. The son she carried had been generated in the house of the man of promises and deserved celestial protection, even being product of human impatience. "Go back to your mistress and submit to her," ordered the divine messenger, accompanying the difficult command with compensatory promise. "I will increase your descendants so much that they will be too numerous to count." The promise echoed that made to Abram, suggesting that Hagar's son would participate in patriarchal blessings, even not being main heir of promises. "You shall name him Ishmael, for the Lord has heard of your misery," declared the angel, conferring prophetic meaning to the Egyptian servant's suffering. Hagar returned to Abram's house, transformed by supernatural experience. She had encountered the God who sees, El Roi, and knew that her affliction hadn't gone unnoticed by the Most High. Sarai's hostility continued, but now it was bearable because there was divine purpose in suffering. When Ishmael was born, Abram was 87 years old. The patriarch received his son with joy, mixed with gratitude and unrest. It was partial fulfillment of descendants' promises, but generated through human methods that perhaps didn't align perfectly with original divine plans. The boy grew strong and vigorous, demonstrating qualities that promised to make him natural leader. Abram loved Ishmael with genuine paternal tenderness, but deep in his heart persisted questioning about whether this was truly the son through whom all Earth's families would be blessed. Ishmael's presence in the house brought fatherhood's long-desired joys, but also perpetuated tensions between Sarai and Hagar that poisoned domestic environment for years. Human solution to divine problem had created complications transcending simple succession question, establishing conflict pattern that would echo through future generations. Sarai watched the boy grow with ambivalent feelings, pride for having provided son to Abram through her servant, but also bitterness for not being herself the patriarchal heir's mother. Ishmael simultaneously represented her victory and defeat, constant reminder of denied fertility and compromised dignity. Years passed with Ishmael growing in Abram's house as apparent heir prince, but divine promises remained only partially fulfilled. The flesh's son had been born, but the promise's son still awaited his divinely determined hour. 13 years had passed since Ishmael's birth, and Abram had grown accustomed to the reality of being father to an energetic and promising young man who grew under his tents. The patriarch, now 99 years old, watched his son with genuine paternal pride, but there remained a shadow of uncertainty deep in his heart about complete fulfillment of divine promises. Ishmael had become a young man of notable qualities, skilled in bow handling, knower of desert ways, natural leader among house servants. He seemed destined to inherit not only Abram's material riches, but also spiritual promises that had motivated the epic journey from Ur of the Chaldeans. It was during this period of apparent tranquility that the Lord appeared again to Abram, this time with manifestation of authority that made air vibrate with creative power. "I am God Almighty. Walk before me faithfully and be blameless," declared the voice that had transformed the patriarch's life decades before. The revealed name, El Shaddai, the Almighty, carried meanings transcending merely human understanding. It was the God sufficient to supply every need, powerful to fulfill promises that defied natural possibilities, capable of making impossible become reality through supernatural intervention. "I will confirm my covenant between me and you, and will greatly increase your numbers," continued the divine voice, indicating that something fundamental was about to change in the nature of relationship between the Eternal and his chosen servant. Abram fell face down, recognizing the magnitude of the moment unfolding. This wasn't common conversation between friends, but formal audience where the universe's creator would establish definitive terms for covenant that would affect countless future generations. "As for me, this is my covenant with you. You will be the father of many nations. No longer will you be called Abram. Your name will be Abraham, for I have made you a father of many nations." The name change wasn't merely cosmetic, but identity transformation reflecting new role in divine plan. Abram meant exalted father, appropriate for prosperous and respected man. But Abraham, father of multitudes, spoke of destiny transcending personal achievement to embrace cosmic responsibility of spiritual fatherhood over countless nations. "I will make you very fruitful. I will make nations of you, and kings will come from you," proclaimed the Most High, expanding promises beyond numerous descendants to include political leadership and royal authority. It wouldn't be just common people born from Abraham's lineage, but monarchs who would govern nations and influence world history's course. "I will establish my covenant as an everlasting covenant between me and you and your descendants after you for the generations to come, to be your God and the God of your descendants after you." The covenant's perpetuity guaranteed that promises wouldn't be limited to Abraham's life, or even his descendants' first generations. It was eternal pact extending through centuries, linking the true God to specific people chosen to be agent of universal blessing. "The whole land of Canaan, where you now reside as a foreigner, I will give as an everlasting possession to you and your descendants after you, and I will be their God." Territorial promise received solemn confirmation eliminating any ambiguity about future rights. Canaan wouldn't be temporary or conditional inheritance, but perpetual possession guaranteed by Creator's own word. The land Abraham traversed as pilgrim would be permanent domain of his descendants, but extraordinary privileges required corresponding responsibilities. This is my covenant with you and your descendants after you, the covenant you are to keep. Every male among you shall be circumcised. Circumcision, established as covenant sign, wasn't empty ritual or arbitrary cultural tradition, but permanent physical mark that would distinguish chosen people from all other nations. Every man carrying that sign in his flesh would daily remember divine promises and obligations accompanying his condition as covenanted people. Any uncircumcised male who has not been circumcised in the flesh will be cut off from his people. He has broken my covenant, warned the Lord, establishing severe consequences for negligence regarding agreed sign. But the most surprising revelations were reserved for Sarai, whose sterility had motivated the expedient of generating son through Hagar. As for Sarai, your wife, you are no longer to call her Sarai. Her name will be Sarah. As in her husband's case, name change reflected destiny transformation. Sarah meant princess, indicating she wouldn't be just patriarch's wife, but mother of kings and nations. Her sterility, which had seemed insuperable obstacle to divine promises, would be transformed into stage for even more spectacular demonstration of the Most High's creative power. I will bless her, and will surely give you a son by her. I will bless her, so that she will be the mother of nations. Kings of peoples will come from her. Specific promise about Sarah cut through decades of maternal frustration like sharp sword, offering hope where there had been only painful resignation. At 89, she would conceive and give birth to the son, through whom all Earth's families would be blessed. Abraham reacted to the promise with mixture of faith and understandable human incredulity. Abraham fell face down. He laughed and said to himself, "Will a son be born to a man 100 years old? Will Sarah bear a child at the age of 90? The laughter wasn't mockery or unbelief, but expression of admiration before promised miracle's magnitude. It was the laughter of one who recognizes witnessing divine intervention completely transcending natural possibilities. Concerned with Ishmael's fate, who had grown as apparent heir for 13 years, Abraham interceded. If only Ishmael might live under your blessing. It was paternal plea from man who genuinely loved concubine's son and desired to guarantee his future welfare. Divine response brought comfort and clarification. And as for Ishmael, I have heard you. I will surely bless him. I will make him fruitful and will greatly increase his numbers. He will be the father of 12 rulers, and I will make him into a great nation. Ishmael would receive significant blessings and become father of powerful nation, but would occupy secondary position in redemptive plan. But my covenant I will establish with Isaac, whom Sarah will bear to you by this time next year." See, the name Isaac, laughter, would eternalize Abraham's reaction to impossible promise, reminding future generations that his birth had been cause of uncontrollable joy for parents who had given up hope of natural fatherhood and motherhood. On the same day he received these extraordinary revelations, Abraham demonstrated immediate obedience to divine instructions. On that very day, Abraham took his son Ishmael and all those born in his household, or bought with his money, every male in his household, and circumcised them, as God told him. Circumcision was performed with ritual precision, including not only immediate family, but all men under patriarchal authority, born in-house or bought with money. It was practical demonstration that covenant extended beyond blood ties to embrace entire community, identifying with Abraham's faith. The patriarch himself, at 99, submitted to ritual along with 13-year-old Ishmael, establishing example of obedience that would characterize his spiritual leadership. He didn't ask others to do something he wasn't willing to do himself. When sun set over the camp on that memorable day, new era had begun in human redemption history. Eternal covenant was sealed not only in verbal promises, but in permanent physical marks that would distinguish chosen people through all coming generations. Abraham and Sarah had received transformed identities reflecting their new roles as parents of multitudes, and stage was set for miraculous birth that would definitively confirm divine faithfulness to most impossible promises. Midday heat weighed upon Mamre's oaks when Abraham, resting at his tent entrance, spotted 3 men approaching along the dusty path. There was something in those travelers' posture and gait that awakened instinctive recognition in the patriarch. These weren't common pilgrims seeking hospitality, but visitors of extraordinary significance. "My lords, if I have found favor in your eyes, do not pass your servant by," Abraham pleaded, prostrating himself in reverence, transcending common courtesy. His 100 years didn't prevent him from running to prepare reception worthy of mysterious visitors. The hospitality that followed was splendid, even by Eastern standards. Sarah, despite her 90 years, quickly kneaded 3 measures of fine flour to make fresh bread. Abraham ran to the cattle, chose tender, good calf, giving it to servant for immediate preparation. Curds, milk, and prepared meat were served under trees' shade, while Abraham stood serving guests personally. During the meal, one of the visitors asked question revealing supernatural knowledge. "Where is your wife Sarah?" It was inquiry no stranger should make, knowing name and family situation of people he supposedly met for first time. "There, in the tent," Abraham responded, growing expectation taking hold of his heart. "I will surely return to you about this time next year, and Sarah, your wife, will have a son." Promise echoed through camp like celestial decree. Sarah, who was listening at tent entrance behind visitor, laughed to herself. At 90, with 100-year-old Abraham, conception and childbirth possibility seemed absurd, even for one who had witnessed miracles during decades of journey with patriarch. "After I am worn out and my Lord is old, will I now have this pleasure?" thought Sarah, her silent laughter mixing incredulity with hope repressed too long. But the Lord, for it was He speaking through visitor, perceived hidden laughter. Why did Sarah laugh and say, "Will I really have a child now that I am old? Is anything too hard for the Lord? I will return to you at the appointed time next year, and Sarah will have a son." Sarah, frightened by having her intimate thoughts exposed, denied, "I did not laugh," but divine response was firm. "Yes, you did laugh." Manifestation continued with even more surprising revelations. Celestial visitors rose to depart, directing their gaze toward Sodom. Abraham accompanied them, and Lord decided to reveal his plans for wicked cities of the plain. "Shall I hide from Abraham what I am about to do? Abraham will surely become a great and powerful nation, and all nations on earth will be blessed through him." Imminent judgment upon Sodom and Gomorrah was revealed with terrible solemnity. The outcry against Sodom and Gomorrah is so great, and their sin so grievous, that I will go down and see if what they have done is as bad as the outcry that has reached me. Abraham, remembering Lot dwelling in Sodom, approached with extraordinary courage to intercede for condemned cities. "Will you sweep away the righteous with the wicked? What if there are 50 righteous people in the city? Will you really sweep it away and not spare the place for the sake of the 50 righteous people in it?" Negotiation that followed revealed both divine justice and mercy. Abraham bargained for entire cities' lives, progressively reducing number of righteous needed to avoid destruction, from 50 to 45, then 40, 30, 20, and finally 10. "For the sake of 10, I will not destroy it," promised Lord before departing, leaving Abraham with certainty that divine justice always tempered judgment with mercy when possible. But when fire and sulfur rained from heaven upon Sodom and Gomorrah, it became clear that not even 10 righteous were found in those corrupted cities. Only Lot and his daughters escaped total destruction, confirming that divine judgment, though terrible, was perfectly just. The following year, exactly as promised, Sarah conceived. News spread through camp like waves in tranquil lake. 90-year-old woman, barren for decades, carried life in her womb. It was miracle defying all natural logic and dramatically confirming power of God, who had called Abraham from Ur. Pregnancy progressed without complications, as if same power allowing conception also protected promised child's development. Sarah experienced for first time motherhood's joys and discomforts, at age when most women had already become great-grandmothers. When time for birth came, Isaac was born healthy and strong, his first cry echoing through camp like celestial music. Abraham, at 100 years, held promise's son in his arms, tears of gratitude mixing with uncontrollable joy's laughter. Sarah said, "God has brought me laughter, and everyone who hears about this will laugh with me," declared the new mother, recognizing her son would be cause of joy not only for her, but for all who knew his extraordinary story. On 8th day, as ordered in covenant, Abraham circumcised Isaac, formally incorporating him into covenantal community. Boy born through supernatural intervention received physical sign identifying him as heir to eternal promises. But Isaac's birth, while bringing ineffable joy, also ignited domestic tensions that had remained latent for years. Ishmael, now 14, watched half-brother with complex feelings of curiosity and jealousy. For years he had been Abraham's only son, presumptive heir to all patriarchal promises. Sarah, transformed by late motherhood, became fiercely protective of her rights, and Isaac's rights. When she saw Ishmael mocking during weaning festivities, her reaction was immediate and inflexible. "Get rid of that slave woman and her son, for that woman's son will never share in the inheritance with my son Isaac." Demand caused great distress to Abraham, who genuinely loved both sons. Ishmael wasn't just firstborn, but companion of more than decade, young man who had brought fatherhood's joys long before Isaac's miraculous birth. But God intervened to resolve paternal dilemma. "Do not be so distressed about the boy and your slave woman. Listen to whatever Sarah tells you, because it is through Isaac that your offspring will be reckoned." Divine decision confirmed that Isaac, not Ishmael, would be heir through whom messianic promises would be fulfilled. But there was consolation for servant's son. "I will make the son of the slave into a nation also, because he is your offspring." Abraham rose early in morning, took bread and skin of water, gave them to Hagar, put them on her shoulders, and sent her off with boy. Separation was painful for all involved, family divided by jealousies and divine promises that couldn't be altered. Hagar and Ishmael departed toward Beersheba desert, carrying only basic provisions and promise that young man would become father of great nation. It was beginning of new journey leading to formation of peoples who would influence history for millennia to come. In Abraham's camp, peace gradually returned. Isaac grew strong and healthy, surrounded by parents' love who had waited for his arrival for decades. Laughter's miracle had been fulfilled, transforming impossible into reality and preparing stage for supreme test of patriarchal faith still to come. Years had passed like gentle breeze over Mamre's oaks. Isaac had grown into young man of exceptional promise, carrying in his bright eyes light of joy he had brought to centenarian parents. At 37, he was Abraham's constant companion on journeys through pastures and moments of worship at altars built throughout Canaan. Relationship between father and son had deepened beyond natural blood bonds. Isaac wasn't just heir to patriarchal riches, but depositary of eternal promises that had motivated epic journey from Ur. Abraham saw in him miraculous fulfillment of decades of hope, son through whom all Earth's families would be blessed. It was during this period of apparent tranquility that God decided to submit his servant to faith's ultimate test. Abraham, called the voice that had transformed his life more than 6 decades before, now laden with solemnity, making air vibrate with cosmic authority. "Here I am," responded Patriarch with promptness, characterizing all his communication with Most High. "Take your son, your only son, whom you love, Isaac, and go to the region of Moriah. Sacrifice him there as a burnt offering on a mountain I will show you." Command cut through Abraham's soul like sharp sword, each word laden with implications challenging everything he understood about divine character and eternal purposes. Sacrificing Isaac would mean destroying not only his beloved son, but apparently all promises of numerous descendants and universal blessing. During the night that followed, Abraham wrestled with questions transcending human comprehension. How could God of justice and mercy demand innocent's death? How would messianic promises be fulfilled if heir were eliminated before generating descendants? Could it be possible that decades of faith and obedience had been based on illusions? But at dawn, when stars began to pale before growing light of morning, Abraham had reached conclusion, demonstrating transcendent faith. The God who had given life to Isaac through impossible miracle possessed power to resurrect him from dead if necessary. Divine promises couldn't fail, even if their fulfillment methods surpassed all earthly understanding. Early the next morning, Abraham got up and loaded his donkey. He took with him 2 of his servants and his son Isaac. When he had cut enough wood for the burnt offering, he set out for the place God had told him about. Meticulous preparation revealed both absolute obedience and paternal love. Abraham didn't delegate to others task of cutting wood or preparing instruments. His own hands prepared everything necessary for son's sacrifice. It was demonstration that true faith doesn't seek escapes when confronted with apparently impossible divine commands. Journey to Moriah transpired in silence, laden with meaning. Isaac walked beside father without suspecting destiny awaiting him, completely trusting Patriarch's wisdom and goodness, who had always been his protector and spiritual guide. On the 3rd day, Abraham looked up and saw the place in the distance. Sight of designated mountain awakened in Abraham's heart mixture of terror and determination. There was place where his faith would be tested to its deepest foundations, where decades of relationship with Most High would culminate in proof defining not only his personal destiny, but future course of redemptive history. "Stay here with the donkey, while I and the boy go over there. We will worship, and then we will come back to you," he said to servants, his words revealing extraordinary faith. He spoke of joint return, indicating certainty that both would descend alive from mountain, even not understanding how this would be possible. Father and son climbed together, Abraham carrying fire and knife, Isaac bearing wood on shoulders. Image was deeply symbolic, son carrying wood of his own sacrifice, echoing future events, when another son would carry wood to nearby mount for sacrifice, redeeming all humanity. "Abraham," Isaac said to his father. "Yes, my son?" Abraham replied. "The fire and wood are here, but where is the lamb for the burnt offering?" Isaac's innocent question pierced paternal heart like spear, but Abraham's response revealed faith transcending circumstances. "God himself will provide the lamb for the burnt offering, my son." It wasn't lie intended to reassure, but expression of absolute confidence in divine providence that would find solution to apparently impossible dilemma. Reaching designated place, Abraham built altar with ritual precision characterizing all his acts of worship. Stone upon stone was carefully positioned, creating sacred place where impossible would become reality through supernatural intervention. Wood was arranged in order upon altar. Then came most terrible moment of entire test. Abraham had to reveal to Isaac true nature of their journey to mountain. No record exists of words exchanged between father and son in that supreme moment, but Isaac's submission suggests he understood and accepted divine will manifested through patriarch. When they reached the place God had told him about, Abraham built an altar there and arranged the wood on it. He bound his son Isaac and laid him on the altar, on top of the wood. Action was performed with infinite tenderness, mixed with absolute determination. Each movement revealed internal struggle between paternal love and divine obedience, but faith prevailed over natural feelings. Then he reached out his hand and took the knife to slay his son. Moment had arrived. Blade gleamed under morning sun as Abraham prepared to perform act that would destroy his heart but demonstrate faith transcending even paternal love. But the angel of the Lord called out to him from heaven, "Abraham, Abraham!" Intervention came at last, possible second, when test was complete, but before irreversible damage was caused. It was demonstration that God tested faith to extreme limits, but never allowed his servants to suffer beyond necessary. Do not lay a hand on the boy. Do not do anything to him. Now I know that you fear God, because you have not withheld from me your son, your only son. Divine declaration confirmed test had been approved with maximum distinction. Abraham's faith had been proven authentic and complete, capable of sacrificing even what was most precious, when obedience to Most High demanded such surrender. Abraham looked up, and there, in a thicket, he saw a ram caught by its horns. Provision arrived exactly when needed, confirming earlier prophecy that God will provide. Substitute ram allowed sacrifice to be completed without human bloodshed, prefiguring future provision when divine lamb would occupy all condemned humanity's place. So Abraham called that place, "The Lord will provide." And to this day it is said, "On the mountain of the Lord it will be provided." Name given to place would eternalize lesson learned about divine providence in supreme crisis moments. Through centuries, that mount would remind all that Abraham's God never fails to supply his faithful servants' needs. Descent journey transpired in completely transformed atmosphere. Father and son had passed through experience linking them on transcendent level, united not only by family bonds, but by joint participation in eternal redemptive plan. Sacrifice on Mount Moriah had sealed forever relationship between Abraham and his God, establishing faith pattern that would echo through millennia. In years following that supreme test, Patriarch experienced deep peace coming from absolute certainty of having pleased Most High in all things. Sarah lived 38 more years after Isaac's birth, witnessing promise's son growth to mature age. At 127, when forces finally depleted, she slept peacefully in certainty of having fulfilled her role in eternal redemption plan. Princess's death brought Abraham first great loss since beginning his epic journey. For more than a century, Sarah had been faithful companion through all trials, from Ur's departure to late motherhood's miracle. Her absence left emptiness no earthly riches could fill. But even in mourning, Abraham demonstrated practical wisdom, making him respected among all Canaan's nations. He approached Heth's sons controlling Hebron region with proposal revealing both prosperity and dignity. He desired to acquire permanent burial for Sarah, establishing legal right to land God had promised his descendants. "I am a foreigner and stranger among you. Sell me some property for a burial site here so I can bury my dead," he declared to Hittites gathered at city gate. Response revealed respect Abraham had earned through decades of just relationships. "Sir, listen to us. You are a mighty prince among us. Bury your dead in the choicest of our tombs." But Abraham insisted on paying fair price for property, refusing favors creating future obligations. Negotiation with Ephron for Machpelah field and cave was conducted with formality, guaranteeing indisputable rights for coming generations. 400 silver shekels changed hands before witnesses, establishing first portion of promised land as family's legal possession. There Sarah was buried with honors due mother of nations, her tomb becoming permanent landmark of faith, overcoming natural impossibilities. With Sarah buried in peace, Abraham turned attention to guaranteeing promises continuity through appropriate marriage for Isaac. Young man, now 40, needed wife sharing patriarchal faith and able to generate descendants through whom divine blessings would flow to all humanity. Do not get a wife for my son from the daughters of the Canaanites, among whom I am living, but go to my country and my own relatives, and get a wife for my son Isaac. Abraham instructed Eliezer, his most faithful servant. Mission entrusted to Eliezer revealed both faith in divine promises and practical wisdom about appropriate matrimonial alliances' importance. Isaac's wife couldn't come from Canaan's idolatrous peoples, but should share spiritual heritage dating back to days in Ur and Haran. Eliezer's journey to Nahor, Abraham's relative's land, was blessed with extraordinary success. By well outside city, he found Rebekah, Nahor's granddaughter, Abraham's brother. Young woman demonstrated not only exceptional physical beauty, but generous character revealed when she offered water not only to traveler, but also to his camels. Sign for which Eliezer had prayed that chosen maiden would offer water for him and his animals, was fulfilled with perfect precision. It was divine confirmation that Rebekah had been designated from eternity to become Promise's son's wife. Negotiations with Rebekah's family progressed smoothly, facilitated by magnificent gifts Eliezer brought and recognition that God's hand guided entire situation. "This is from the Lord," relatives declared, agreeing to marriage uniting two branches of Terah's original family. When Isaac saw Rebekah approaching mounted on camel at evening, it was love at first sight, sealing union destined to perpetuate Abrahamic promises. Isaac brought her into the tent of his mother Sarah, and he married Rebekah. So she became his wife, and he loved her, and Isaac was comforted after his mother's death. Abraham's final years were marked by serenity of man who had completely fulfilled his divine calling. He still took another wife, Keturah, who bore 6 sons, but these received only gifts and were sent to eastern lands, guaranteeing Isaac remained sole heir to spiritual promises. Final blessing Abraham pronounced over Isaac contained prophetic power extending through countless generations. Through this lineage, all Earth's families would truly be blessed. Promise's son would carry forward not only material riches, but spiritual inheritance transforming human history. When Abraham finally breathed his last, at a good old age, an old man and full of years, at 175, he was gathered to his people with dignity few mortals ever achieved. He had left Ur as prosperous merchant, seeking divine promises fulfillment. He died as father of nations and friend of God, having seen from afar fulfillment of all promised to him. Isaac and Ishmael, reunited for first time since forced separation decades before, buried their father in Machpelah cave beside Sarah. Temporary reconciliation of 2 sons over paternal sepulchre symbolized that Abraham's legacy transcended human divisions, embracing multiple lineages that would influence civilization's course. Abraham's name didn't die with his body. Through coming centuries, it would be invoked as supreme model of faith, trusting divine promises, even when all physical evidence pointed in opposite direction. Jews would call him our father Abraham. Christians would see in him prototype of justification by faith, and Muslims would venerate him as Ibrahim, Allah's intimate friend. The land he had received as eternal inheritance awaited final fulfillment of promises when descendants numerous as sea's sand would take definitive possession of entire region from Egypt's river to Great Euphrates. The seed had been planted, Future harvests would confirm that Abraham truly deserved the title of father of many nations. His story would echo through the halls of the U.S. Capitol, where lawmakers would invoke his example of covenant faithfulness. It would inspire pioneers crossing the Great Plains, seeking their own promised lands beyond the Mississippi. It would comfort immigrants arriving at Ellis Island, carrying nothing but faith in America's promise of blessing for all who dared to believe. Like those early settlers who left everything behind to chase the American dream, Abraham had abandoned security for the unknown. Like the founding fathers who pledged their lives, fortunes, and sacred honor to an uncertain cause, he had risked everything on divine promises that seemed impossible. From sea to shining sea, his legacy would live on, in the faith of a nation built on the belief that with God, all things are possible, and that even the impossible dreams of ordinary people can change the world forever. The patriarch's final rest came not with defeat, but with victory. He had seen the promise's beginning, and in faith's eyes beheld its glorious end. The boy Isaac would carry forward the covenant, generation after generation, until that final day when all Earth's families would indeed find their blessing through Abraham's seed. In the quiet of Hebron's hills, where Sarah slept beside her husband, the wind still whispers of promises kept and faith rewarded. The God who called one man from Ur had begun a story that would never end, a story of faith, hope, and love that would echo through all generations until time itself should cease. Abraham's journey was complete. The rest of the story belonged to Isaac and to Isaac's children, and to all who would follow in the footsteps of the man who believed God and was called his friend forever.